The year was 2278, and humanity had finally carved a place for itself in the broader galactic community. Earth, once an isolated blue marble on the fringes of a seemingly infinite universe, had become a bustling hub of interstellar diplomacy and trade. The vast corridors of the International Spaceport, a floating megastructure tethered just outside Earth's atmosphere, were teeming with alien species of all shapes and sizes. Their languages, customs, and technologies all mixed together in the most advanced marketplace in human history. Ambassador Kale Armand strode through the polished metal halls of the spaceport with his AI assistant, Iris, hovering silently beside him. Kale was no stranger to alien diplomacy. In his 38 years of service, he had negotiated trade agreements with insectoid civilizations from the Kepler system, mediated peace talks between warring factions from the Sirius colony, and even danced, somewhat awkwardly, at the wedding of a gelatinous prince from the Zenta Nebula. But none of that experience prepared him for the meeting today. The Ravnak were different. Rumors about the Ravnak had been circulating through the galaxy for centuries, but few had ever encountered them. They were an ancient and secretive race, spoken of in hushed tones. Stories of their advanced technology and terrifying military might spread like wildfire among other species, though their motivations remained a mystery. Their fleets moved silently through the void, and entire star systems fell under their dominion without a single shot fired. And now, they had come to Earth. Kale's hand tightened around the data pad as he neared the docking bay. His reflection flashed across the steel walls, his face betraying his unease. He prided himself on his composure, but even the most seasoned diplomat would feel the pressure of this encounter. Today, he wasn't just representing Earth, he was standing between humanity and a potential galactic force that could obliterate their world with a flick of a wrist. Ambassador, Iris chimed in, her voice smooth and reassuring, your heart rate has increased by 12%. Shall I adjust your neural stress inhibitors? Kale shook his head, forcing a smile. I'll be fine, Iris. Just nerves. Very well. I've prepared all available data on the Ravnak. Though, there isn't much. That's what concerns me, Kale muttered under his breath. As he reached the docking bay, Kale stopped before the massive sealed door. Beyond it lay the Ravnak vessel, a sleek, black craft that seemed to absorb the light around it, casting the surrounding spaceport into a dim shadow. Earth's military personnel stood on high alert, their eyes fixed on the ship, their fingers hovering near weapons, though they all knew those weapons would be useless if things went wrong. The door hissed open with a hydraulic release, and a single figure emerged from the Ravnak ship. Kale's breath caught in his throat. Commander Zyvrin, the Ravnak's representative, was an imposing figure. Nearly 7 feet tall, her sleek, jet-black exoskeleton shimmered as she moved with inhuman grace. Her 4 eyes, too large and too smaller beneath them, glimmered with a cold, predatory intelligence. Her limbs were long and segmented, with spindly, razor-sharp digits that seemed capable of rending metal. Even in a chamber filled with military personnel, Kale felt a primal fear tug at his instincts, as though standing before an apex predator. Yet, it wasn't just her physical presence that unnerved him, it was the overwhelming aura of power and control that radiated from her. Kale had heard stories about the Ravnak's dominance in the far reaches of the galaxy, how they subjugated entire civilizations without a fight, and now, he understood why. There was something about Zyvrin that made resistance seem futile. Zyvrin moved forward, her piercing gaze locking onto Kale, as though she were sizing him up, measuring his worth. Ambassador Kale Armand, she said, her voice a low, guttural hiss that somehow emerged in perfect English. Her mandibles flexed slightly as she spoke, revealing sharp, needle-like teeth beneath her armored exterior. I am Commander Zyvrin, representing the Ravnak Empire. Earth's invitation has intrigued us. Kale blinked, momentarily caught off guard by her flawless grasp of his language. He quickly composed himself, stepping forward with a practiced diplomatic smile. Commander Zyvrin, on behalf of Earth, we welcome you to our planet and to the International Spaceport. We are honored by your visit. Zyvern's multifaceted eyes glistened, observing him with an intensity that made Kale feel exposed. She seemed to study every twitch of his muscles, every breath, as though searching for weaknesses hidden beneath his polite exterior. "Honor," she repeated, as if testing the word. "We shall see if your species is worthy of honor." The Ravnak do not waste time on sentiment. Kale nodded slowly. "We understand that your people value efficiency and power. I assure you, Earth has much to offer in both." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Indeed. But I have not come here to speak of trade or technology, Ambassador. I have come to understand your species in the most fundamental way: how you propagate. We have examined your biological structure, and your reproductive methods confuse us. They seem inefficient and slow. We require a demonstration." Kale's heart skipped a beat. Did she just say a demonstration? "A demonstration?" he echoed, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "You mean you wish to learn about human reproduction?" "Precisely," Zyvern replied, her tone devoid of any humor or ambiguity. "Your species' survival depends on how you reproduce, does it not? This process interests the Ravnak. You are a fragile species with limited longevity. Understanding this weakness is essential if we are to assess your worth." Kale was at a loss for words. This wasn't the first question he had prepared for. He had expected negotiations about trade, technology, maybe even military alliances. But human reproduction? I'm not sure that's a suitable subject for a diplomatic discussion, Kale said, carefully choosing his words. Zyvern stepped closer, her towering frame casting a shadow over him. "You misunderstand, Ambassador. The Ravnak do not negotiate. We learn. If we are to ally with your species, we must know all aspects of your existence. This reproduction process of yours is critical. You will show me how it works." Kale's mind raced. His mouth went dry. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, waiting for his response. But how could he explain that this was impossible? The Ravnak were more advanced than any species humanity had encountered. How could they not understand that reproduction wasn't something you just showed? "I believe we can provide you with a detailed scientific explanation of human biology and reproduction," Kale said cautiously. "Our best experts can dash." "No," Zyvern interrupted sharply. "I do not want explanations. I want to see it for myself. A live demonstration." The room went deathly silent. Kale felt a cold sweat forming on his brow. This was spiraling out of control, and fast. "Commander Zyvern, I'm afraid that's not possible. Human reproduction is not a simple process that can be demonstrated on command." Zyvern's eyes flashed, and for a brief moment, Kale thought he saw something almost predatory in her gaze. But just as quickly, it was gone. She turned her back to him, walking toward the exit of the docking bay. "Very well, Ambassador. You have 24 Earth hours to provide what we have asked for. If you fail, our interest in Earth may diminish." Kale's heart pounded in his chest as he watched her disappear back into her ship. The door sealed shut behind her with a thud that echoed through the chamber, leaving Kale standing in stunned silence. Iris hovered next to him, her voice calm and analytical. "Ambassador, I believe we are in a difficult position." Kale let out a long, shaky breath. "That's putting it lightly, Iris. What have we gotten ourselves into?" The Ravnak had arrived, and they wanted more than just an alliance. They wanted to unravel the very core of human existence. And the fate of Earth rested in Kale's hands. Kale had barely made it back to his quarters before the weight of the Ravnak request hit him full force. The entire diplomatic team had been preparing for months to meet the galaxy's most powerful species, but no one had anticipated this, a demand for a live demonstration of human reproduction. It was absurd, impossible. But for the Ravnak, it was deadly serious. They were a species that viewed efficiency and strength as the highest virtues, and they weren't interested in long-winded explanations or cultural context. They wanted results, or Earth's future would hang by a thread. The next morning, the gravity of the situation had spread like wildfire throughout the Earth Biological Institute, located just off the main spaceport. The institute, known for its cutting-edge research in human genetics, cloning, and xenobiology, had become the front line for what could be one of humanity's most critical interactions with an alien race. But the subject matter was anything but typical. Kale entered the sterile, brightly lit halls of the institute, flanked by a team of Earth's top scientists. Dr. Elena Takahashi, a renowned geneticist and expert in human biology, led the group. She was a petite woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper intellect, her hair pulled back in a severe knot. She had been working tirelessly through the night, preparing a presentation that would satisfy the Ravnok's request, or at least, by Earth sometime. "I'm still not sure how we're going to pull this off," Kale said, glancing at the tablet in his hand, which displayed the latest drafts of the presentation. Dr. Takahashi gave him a sideways look. "I don't think anyone's ever been asked to present human reproduction as part of an interspecies diplomatic crisis. But if anyone can pull it off, it's us." They entered the main research chamber, where the holographic projection systems were already up and running. Large, rotating models of human DNA, cellular structures, and embryonic development floated in the air. The sterile environment of the lab buzzed with nervous energy as assistants and biologists checked and rechecked the visuals. Kale stared at the massive, holographic double helix rotating before them. "This is all too much," he muttered under his breath. "We're about to explain sex to an alien species that probably sees it as primitive and inefficient. What if they don't understand? What if this just makes things worse?" Dr. Takahashi adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. "The Ravnok are data-driven, Kale. They want facts, not cultural niceties. We'll give them the facts, and we'll hope that's enough. But, if I'm being honest, this is a gamble." Kale exhaled, feeling the tension crawl up his spine. "And if they decide we're inefficient? They'll probably do what they've done to other species they consider obsolete," Takahashi said, her voice grim. "Eliminate us." The door to the lab slid open with a quiet hiss, and in walked the last person Kale wanted to see right now, Commander Zyvern. The Ravnok leader's presence sucked the air out of the room. She was flanked by two silent, armored figures, Ravnok warriors, their insectoid bodies encased in sleek, black exosuits that seemed to hum with barely contained energy. They didn't speak, but their mere presence was enough to send a wave of anxiety through the human team. Kale swallowed hard and stepped forward, offering the most diplomatic smile he could muster. "Commander Zyvern, welcome to the Earth Biological Institute. We've prepared an in-depth presentation on human reproduction, as you requested." Zyvern's multifaceted eyes gleamed in the cold light of the lab, and for a moment, Kale could swear that her mandibles twitched in anticipation. "Proceed," she hissed, her voice devoid of emotion. "I expect to learn something useful." Dr. Takahashi took a deep breath and stepped forward, activating the first series of holograms. "To understand human reproduction, we must start at the most basic level, our cellular structure. Humans are a sexually reproducing species, which means we rely on the combination of two different sets of genetic material to create a new individual." The hologram zoomed in, showing the splitting of a cell and the formation of gamete sperm and egg cells. Dr. Takahashi continued, explaining the basics of meiosis and fertilization. Zyvern watched with an intensity that bordered on unsettling, her eyes flickering between the holographic cells and the human scientists. "The process begins when the male gamete, the sperm, fertilizes the female gamete, the egg. This combination of genetic material results in the formation of a zygote, which contains the necessary DNA to form a new human life." Zyvern's mandibles clicked together softly as she observed the holographic projection of a zygote multiplying into an embryo. "This is inefficient," she said coldly. Your species requires two individuals to reproduce, introducing the potential for error and weakness. Why not eliminate the need for sexual reproduction and focus on cloning superior genetic stock? Kale had expected this question, but the coldness of her tone still sent a chill down his spine. He glanced at Dr. Takahashi, who nodded and pulled up the next set of holograms, showing the genetic diversity of humans. Sexual reproduction, Dr. Takahashi explained, while slower and more resource-intensive, introduces genetic diversity. This diversity makes our species adaptable to environmental changes, diseases, and external threats. Cloning, while more efficient in the short term, would lead to a lack of genetic variation and an inability to evolve. In essence, human reproduction ensures the survival of the species in the face of an unpredictable future. Zyvern tilted her head, her expression unreadable. You choose to introduce chaos into your existence for the sake of survival? Chaos breeds weakness. Emotions, bonds, attachments, these are distractions. Kale couldn't remain silent any longer. He stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. It's true that human reproduction is more complex than simply combining DNA. But it's that complexity, those bonds and attachments, that have allowed us to thrive. We care for our young, we form families and communities, and those emotional connections drive us to protect one another. It's what makes us more than just biological machines. Zyvern's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze flickering toward Kale. You speak of emotions as if they are strength. Yet they make you vulnerable. Your kind fights wars over emotions, crumbles under the weight of personal attachments. The Ravnak have no such weakness. Kale met her gaze, refusing to back down. Emotions can be a weakness, yes. But they can also be the source of our greatest strength. Love, empathy, trust, these aren't just sentiments. They're the foundation of our society. They push us to innovate, to protect, to endure. You wanted to understand why our species survives despite its inefficiencies? This is why. Zyvern's mandibles twitched again, though whether in frustration or fascination, Kale couldn't tell. For a long moment, the room was silent. The tension was thick, as if the very air had grown heavy with anticipation. Finally, Zyvern spoke. This attachment you call love. You claim it strengthens your species. Prove it. Kale blinked. Prove it? How do you propose I dash? Zyvern cut him off with a sharp gesture. You say that your emotions, your bonds, drive you to survive. Show me how this process of reproduction intertwines with this love. I require a demonstration. A live one. The room fell into a stunned silence. Dr. Takahashi shot Kale a panicked look. This was getting out of hand. Kale swallowed hard. Commander, I don't think you understand. Human reproduction is not something that can be demonstrated on command. It's a personal and private matter. Zyvern's gaze bore into him. I understand more than you think, Ambassador. The Ravnak value efficiency, but you speak of something deeper. You claim this emotional connection is part of your survival. Show me, or perhaps your species has been misleading us. Kale's heart pounded in his chest. He had to find a way to turn this situation around, to make Zyvern understand that human reproduction wasn't just a biological function, but something far more profound. And yet, the Ravnak's cold, logical mindset left little room for explanations rooted in emotion. We can't show you a live demonstration, Kale said carefully, but what we can do is share with you the essence of what drives us to reproduce and form families. It's not just about survival, it's about connection. And that connection, Commander Zyvern, is what makes us human. For a long, tense moment, Zyvern said nothing. Then, with a slight tilt of her head, she turned toward the exit. You have given me much to consider, Ambassador. I will return tomorrow for your final demonstration. Be prepared. As the doors slid shut behind her, Kale let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The room buzzed with nervous energy, and Dr. Takahashi shot him a look of both relief and concern. "That was close," she whispered. Kale nodded, still shaken. "Too close. But I'm not sure how much longer we can keep stalling her." He stared at the holograms of human DNA still floating in the air, feeling the weight of the impossible task before him. The Ravnak didn't just want to understand human biology, they wanted to unravel what made humanity unique. And the future of Earth might depend on whether or not Kale could make them see that some things, like love, were beyond science. Time was running out. The room was deathly quiet after Commander Zyvern's departure. Kale could hear the faint hum of the holographic projectors and the soft beeping of scientific instruments, but the air was thick with tension. Every scientist and diplomat present in the room seemed frozen, as if processing the enormity of what had just happened. They had bought themselves a little time, but the Ravnak wouldn't wait forever. Their interest in human reproduction was no longer just scientific curiosity, it was a test. One that Kale wasn't sure they could pass. Dr. Takahashi broke the silence first. "Kale, this is getting out of control. A live demonstration? What does she expect us to do? There's no way we can give her what she wants." Kale rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I don't think it's about the mechanics anymore. Zyvern's not just asking about biology. She's testing us, testing whether there's something more to our species than what she considers inefficient." "You think this is some kind of cultural evaluation?" Dr. Takahashi asked, eyes narrowing. Kale nodded. "The Ravnak see us as weak because we're emotional, because we form attachments. They value strength and efficiency above all else. If we can't convince them that what they see as weaknesses are actually our strengths, Earth might not survive whatever they have planned." Dr. Takahashi looked thoughtful. "So what do we do? We can't exactly demonstrate love in a lab." Kale stared at the holograms still floating in the air, images of fertilized eggs, dividing cells, growing embryos. They were all clinically accurate but devoid of the true meaning behind human reproduction. The Ravnak needed to understand something far more profound. They needed to understand why humans cherished the bonds they formed, and what drove them to create life in the first place. "We're going to have to take a different approach," Kale said finally, standing straighter. "We'll explain the science, yes, but we need to show them something more. They need to understand that love, connection, and family are integral to what makes us human. And to do that, I need to speak to Zyvern directly alone." Dr. Takahashi frowned. "Alone? Are you sure that's wise?" Kale gave her a grim smile. "I don't have a choice. The Ravnak don't respect groups, committees, or collaborative efforts. They respect strength, and I need to show Zyvern that strength comes from something deeper than biology." With that, Kale left the institute and headed back to his quarters. He spent the rest of the day preparing, mentally running through every diplomatic encounter he'd ever had, every argument that might persuade Zyvern that humans weren't just biological machines. By the time the sun set, Kale was exhausted, but his resolve was solidified. He would meet with Zyvern on her terms, and he would prove to her that human reproduction, humanity itself, was about far more than efficiency. The next evening, Kale received a message from the Ravnak delegation. Zyvern had summoned him to her ship, alone. As he approached the docking bay where the sleek, black Ravnak vessel was anchored, Kale felt a chill run down his spine. He could feel the eyes of Earth's security personnel on him, but they remained at a distance, knowing that any show of force would be futile against the Ravnak. If things went wrong, there would be no stopping them. The doors to the ship slid open with a whisper, and Kale stepped inside, immediately enveloped in the strange, sterile atmosphere of the alien craft. The walls were smooth and black, reflecting the dim light in strange, distorted patterns. He could hear the faint hum of alien technology, but everything felt unsettlingly quiet. Commander Zyvern was waiting for him in a dark chamber at the heart of the ship. The room was stark, devoid of any decoration or warmth. Zyvern stood in the center, her tall, imposing figure casting long shadows across the floor. Her black exoskeleton gleamed in the dim light, and her eyes cold and unblinking fixed on Kale as he approached. "Ambassador Armand," Zyvern hissed, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "You have returned. I hope you are prepared to provide the demonstration I requested." Kale steeled himself, standing tall despite the overwhelming presence of the alien commander. "Commander Zyvern, I understand your desire to witness human reproduction firsthand, but I must clarify something. What you're asking for isn't just a biological process, it's the foundation of who we are as a species. You won't learn what you need to by watching cells divide. You need to understand the emotional and cultural significance behind it." Zyvern's mandibles twitched, and she took a step closer, towering over him. "Emotions. You keep speaking of emotions as though they hold power. We Ravnak do not indulge in such weaknesses. We see only strength and efficiency. If you cannot demonstrate that your species possesses such qualities, our interest in Earth may come to an end. And when we lose interest, Ambassador, your planet's survival may not be guaranteed." Kale's heart raced, but he held his ground. He had expected this threat. The Ravnak didn't conquer through brute force, they conquered through intimidation, by making their potential allies or victims feel insignificant. But Kale wasn't about to let Zyvern dismiss humanity so easily. "You're wrong," Kale said firmly. "Emotions aren't a weakness, they're what make us strong. They push us to protect our families, to create art, to innovate, to fight for survival even when the odds are against us. Human reproduction isn't just about creating life, it's about the connections we form that drive us to build a future for that life." Zyvern narrowed her eyes. "Words, Ambassador. You speak of these connections, but you have yet to prove their worth. Show me, or Earth will be deemed unworthy of Ravnak consideration." Kale took a deep breath. This was the moment. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small holographic projector, placing it on the ground between them. "I can't show you a live demonstration of reproduction," he said, "but I can show you what it means to us." The projector activated, and a series of holograms filled the room. They weren't clinical or scientific this time. Instead, the images showed families, mothers and fathers holding their newborn children, parents teaching their kids to walk, laugh, and play, families sitting together around dinner tables, sharing stories, laughing, and comforting one another. The holograms flickered with scenes of life, weddings, celebrations, funerals, moments of joy and sorrow. All of it connected by the bond of family, love, and the desire to protect and nurture. "This is what reproduction means to us," Kale said softly, as Zyvern watched the holograms with an unreadable expression. "It's not just about survival, it's about building a future, one that's worth fighting for. It's about love, Commander Zyvern. And that love gives us the strength to endure, even in the face of overwhelming odds. You see vulnerability in our emotions, but I see strength. It's what makes us human." For a long, tense moment, Zyvern said nothing. She stared at the holograms, her cold, insectoid eyes reflecting the images of human life in ways that made Kale unsure of what she was thinking. The Ravnak commander's silence stretched on, and Kale's heart pounded in his chest. Had he said too much? Too little? Was this going to be enough? Finally, Zyvern spoke, her voice low and measured. "You claim that this, love, makes your species stronger. That it drives you to survive, even when efficiency would dictate otherwise. I find your reasoning curious." Kale held his breath. Zyvern stepped forward, her towering form casting a shadow over the holograms. "The Ravnak do not value such sentiment. But I will admit, Ambassador, that your species is unique. Perhaps there is strength in your attachment to one another that we have not yet understood." Kale exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of her words. Zyvern turned her back to him, her posture as rigid and commanding as ever. "I will report this to my superiors. Whether or not Earth is deemed worthy of an alliance remains to be seen. But your demonstration has given us much to consider. Kale stood there, feeling both relieved and uncertain. He had bought humanity some time, perhaps even a chance, but there were no guarantees when it came to the Ravnak. As Zyvern left the room, her final words echoed in his mind. You claim that love is a strength, Ambassador. But remember this, it is also a vulnerability. As the doors closed behind her, Kale knew that Earth's future hung on the delicate balance between strength and vulnerability, and only time would tell which one the Ravnak valued more. The next day, Kale returned to Earth's diplomatic headquarters, where his team awaited news. He shared the details of the meeting with Zyvern, and though there was relief that the Ravnak hadn't declared war, the tension remained palpable. Earth was still under scrutiny, still vulnerable to the whims of a species that saw emotions as dangerous liabilities. But Kale knew one thing for certain: humanity's strength lay in its connections, and its ability to form bonds that transcended mere biology. And in a galaxy filled with cold, calculating logic, perhaps that was the one thing that could truly set them apart. For now, Earth had survived. But the test was far from over. The hours that followed Kale's encounter with Commander Zyvern were some of the longest of his life. Back on Earth, the international spaceport bustled with activity, but within the diplomatic quarters, everything seemed to slow to a crawl. Each moment felt like an eternity as Kale waited for word from the Ravnak. Would his emotional appeal resonate with them? Would they deem Earth worthy of survival, or would their cold logic decide humanity was too inefficient to bother with? Kale sat at his desk, staring out of the window toward the stars. Earth, as peaceful as it looked from up here, was vulnerable, more vulnerable than it had ever been. One decision from Zyvern, one recommendation to her superiors, and the Ravnak could either leave them in peace or wipe them from the galaxy without a second thought. The door to his quarters slid open, and Iris, his ever-reliable AI assistant, hovered into the room. Ambassador, I've received a transmission from the Ravnak vessel. Commander Zyvern requests your presence. Immediately. Kale stood up, his heart pounding. This was it. The decision had been made. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him as he straightened his jacket and followed Iris toward the docking bay once more. As he entered the Ravnak vessel for the second time, the oppressive atmosphere of the alien ship seemed even heavier than before. The dark, sleek interior was as cold and foreboding as ever, but this time Kale was not as fearful. He had done all he could. Now, it was up to Zyvern and the Ravnak to decide the fate of his people. The chamber where Zyvern waited was dimly lit, her tall figure standing rigid at the center. Her four eyes, as dark and unreadable as ever, locked onto Kale as soon as he entered. The holograms from their previous encounter had been deactivated, leaving only the two of them in the room face to face. Ambassador Armand, Zyvern said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The Ravnak have deliberated on your species. Kale stood still, his heart racing in his chest. And what have you decided? For a long moment, Zyvern said nothing. She stared at him, as if weighing her words carefully. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, she stepped closer. We, the Ravnak, have always valued strength, precision, and efficiency. These traits have allowed us to dominate vast stretches of the galaxy without challenge. We have seen countless species rise and fall, many of them failing due to their own inefficiencies, their emotional attachments, their weaknesses. Kale's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't interrupt. He knew there was more. Your species, Zyvern continued, is flawed. Your biological reproduction is slow, your dependence on emotional bonds weakens you, and your species is driven by instincts that are irrational by our standards. Kale's heart sank. He had known the Ravnak would see humanity's emotional nature as a weakness, but hearing it spelled out so coldly felt like a knife to the chest. And yet, Zyvern said, her tone shifting ever so slightly, there is something curious about your kind. Despite your inefficiencies, you survive. More than that, You thrive in a universe that is hostile, unpredictable, and dangerous. Kale blinked, surprised by the unexpected compliment, if it could be called that. Zyvern's mandibles twitched. Your species has a resilience that we did not fully comprehend. You claim that your emotional bonds, your concept of love, make you stronger. While we, the Ravnak, view these attachments as a vulnerability, we cannot ignore the fact that they have driven your people to achieve great things technologically, culturally, and even militarily. She stepped closer, her multifaceted eyes gleaming in the dim light. Your demonstration, as primitive as it may have seemed to us, has revealed something we did not expect. You see strength in what we see as weakness. And perhaps, Ambassador, there is merit in that. Kale felt a glimmer of hope. Could it be that Zyvern and the Ravnak were starting to understand? Zyvern continued, her voice still cold, but with a faint undercurrent of something new curiosity. The Ravnak do not embrace weakness. We do not tolerate inefficiency. But we do value potential. Your species has potential, Ambassador. You have survived not because of your strength, but because of your adaptability. Your ability to form emotional connections, to care for one another, has given you a resilience that we underestimated. Kale's pulse quickened. He had never heard a Ravnak speak this way before, especially not one as formidable as Zyvern. Could it be that they had finally seen something of value in humanity? However, Zyvern added, her tone sharpening, this potential does not guarantee your survival. The Ravnak do not form alliances lightly. We will not offer protection to a species we deem unworthy. But for now, we will observe. Observe? Kale repeated, uncertain of what she meant. Zyvern inclined her head ever so slightly. The Ravnak will not destroy your world, Ambassador. We will allow your species to continue its development, and we will watch. If, in time, you prove that your emotional bonds, your concept of love can truly strengthen your species beyond its weaknesses, then perhaps we will consider an alliance. Kale felt a wave of relief wash over him, though he knew this was far from a victory. The Ravnak were giving humanity a chance, a precarious one, but it was better than outright rejection or annihilation. And if we fail? Kale asked, knowing full well the answer but needing to hear it. If you fail, Zyvern said, her voice chilling, the Ravnak will not intervene to protect your world. We will leave you to your fate, whether that comes from internal collapse or external threats. Kale nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the situation. Humanity had been given a chance, but that chance came with the heavy burden of proving themselves, proving that their emotional connections, their love, were not weaknesses, but strengths that could carry them through the challenges of an unforgiving universe. Thank you, Commander Zyvern, Kale said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. We will do everything we can to prove ourselves worthy of your consideration. Zyvern's mandibles twitched again, a gesture that Kale had come to interpret as something close to approval. We shall see, Ambassador. The Ravnak are patient. But do not mistake our patience for leniency. Your species is on trial, and your future depends on your ability to rise above your weaknesses. With that, she turned, her tall, imposing figure fading into the shadows of the ship's interior. Kale stood there for a moment, letting her words sink in. Humanity had been spared, for now. But the road ahead would not be easy. The Ravnak would be watching, waiting for any sign that humans were not worthy of their continued existence. And Kale knew that they would have to fight not just with weapons, but with their hearts, their connections, and their ability to show that love was indeed the greatest strength of all. The return to Earth was bittersweet. As Kale entered the international spaceport, he was met with cautious optimism. His team, along with leaders from around the world, waited anxiously for news. Kale delivered the message as plainly as he could. Earth had been given a reprieve, but they were still under the Ravnak's scrutiny. Dr. Takahashi, standing at the back of the room, approached him after the briefing. So, we're still in the game? She asked, her voice laced with both relief and concern. Kale nodded. For now. Zyvern admitted that they see potential in us, but they're waiting to see if we can prove ourselves. It's not a permanent alliance, it's more like being on probation. Takahashi let out a slow breath. Well, that's better than the alternative. But how do we prove to a species like the Ravnak that emotions are strength? Kale smiled, though there was a hint of exhaustion behind it. We do what we've always done. We survive. We build. We connect. We prove that what they see as weakness, our love for one another, is what will carry us forward. Takahashi gave a small nod. And what about you? Do you think they'll ever really understand us? Kale glanced out of the window, where the Ravnak ship still hung in orbit like a dark shadow. I don't know. But I think Zyvern's beginning to see that there's more to us than she first thought. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. As the earth below spun beneath him, Kale couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Humanity had survived one of its most dangerous encounters yet, not by brute force, but by holding on to the very things that made them human. The Ravnak might never fully understand love, but they had seen its power, and for now, that was enough to give Earth a fighting chance. And as long as they had that, Kale believed they could face whatever the future had in store.